Hello, well, I'm in the leather workshop today and I thought I'd run through how I get good stitch quality. I've done an awful lot of machine sewing now and I found there are a few little refinements one can make to get really nice results. So I've been doing things recently, apart from quite a lot of bags, been making some little wallet books, things like that. And it does call for quite good precision sewing around the curves, etc. So, probably about 10 or so tips in this one. I'll get going. Well, first up you do need a reasonable sewing machine, and because I do a lot of leather bag sewing, I use a medium weight cylinder arm flatbed machine, and it's got what's called compound feed, and I think that's probably the number one thing. The challenge for a leather sewing machine is actually going across seams. It's very difficult because the foot, if you think about it, is having to climb over the bump of a seam, and at the same time you're having to pull the slippery leather through the sort of transit mechanism. So it's quite a technical challenge, and I have put a film up on sewing machines and selecting them, but the key things really is to have what I call needle feed. It's where the needle literally walks forward as it sews and pulls the leather through, the slippery leather through. You have a good bottom feed which does like a ovalized motion to drag the leather through, and you have like a walking foot which also helps to keep the leather down at the right point in the needle stroke, and also again helps to drag it all through. So yeah, compound feed machine, pretty essential if you're doing precision stitching. Obviously if you're just doing sort of more things like axe covers, knife sheaths, a drop feed machine's perfectly okay. But that's number one, and I'll just zoom you in quickly. So this is the sort of thing I mean. If you look at the needle very carefully, you'll see, perhaps I put my finger there, it's moving along with the foot, and that's pushing the leather through and getting a nice even stitch. So that's number one. The next thing to watch for is to make sure you got the right thread and needle combination, and there are various charts on the internet for sorting out what's what. Essentially, you don't want too big a needle. That's the mistake a lot of people make when they first start using a sewing machine. And you want also to have the right size of thread. And again, I think there's a tendency for people to over-engineer and think, oh, I must have a massively strong thread. Now, if you come from a woodworking background, you'll probably know if you put in one little tack into something, it's easy to pull it out. It's not terribly strong. If you put in a row of like 10 tacks, it's pretty strong. And it's the same idea with sewing. One stitch on its own isn't going to be very strong. A row of 10 stitches would be pretty tough. So you can get away with actually using quite a fine thread. Now, I use what's called bonded nylon thread, which I find very good for machine sewing with leather. And I tend to use mostly size 40 in the European measures. Now it'll translate differently, I appreciate, in the States. And if I'm doing finer work, I use the likes of a 60. If I'm doing very heavy duty work, I'll use a 20. I think the things to say about the thread is you want to have it that it's strong enough. The best way actually is to try destroying the seam and see what breaks first, whether it's the leather or the thread. And you'll obviously find that's partly dependent on the closeness of your stitches. But that's what I do. I destroy my products before I make them fully up, and then I know whether it's going to hold or not. I've never had a seam fail. I've never had someone come back with a bag, but I certainly don't intend to have that happen. But yeah, err on the side where you can of using a finer needle and a finer thread. So that's, if you like, tip number two. Tip number three is actually to make sure you've got a well lit surface. Now at the moment I've got a camera filming, so it's particularly well lit. But what I have on my machines are these little magnetic lights, and little LED lights that run off the motor, and they're really good. If you have a clutch motor you can still get them, you can plug them in the mains, and they just light up the sewing area, and it gives you enough light to see clearly what's going on, but I find that my accuracy increases by having very good light. So that's tip number three. Tip number four is always to do a little test run of stitches to check your thread tension. Now what you're looking for with thread tension is whether the stitches, they should form, because they're like loops each side of your leather piece. You're looking to see whether they form evenly with the loops forming in the centre of two bits of leather. You don't want the loops sort of just forming on the top or on the bottom only. And I probably should do a separate film on this where I'll put up a micro camera, but essentially what you're doing is you're adjusting the tension dial on your machine if you find that it's wrong. And in this case I've just done a little test strip and it's going too flat underneath. I don't know if you're going to see this on camera, but it's the loops are forming underneath the two bits of leather, so one thread is going like a straight line and the top bit is going with huge loops right the way through both layers of the leather, and it's not going to be a very good or very strong or very neat seam. So what I need to do is increase my top tension, and I do a little adjustment on the tension knob, and that will pull the thread back up and get it so they loop in the centre of the two bits of leather. Sometimes you have to adjust the bobbin tension, and you can do what's called a drop test for that, but I think perhaps I'll put that in as a separate film sometime. Tip number 5 is about how you can keep your bits of leather closely aligned up while you're sewing. And you can't pin leather normally, so you really got a couple of options. I sometimes use these little plastic patchwork workers clips, and you can just go around clipping your bits of leather, and then as you come to sew you can take the clips off. That's one option. Some people use double-sided tape, which is quite effective, and another option is to use some fairly fast setting leather glue. You can just go around your seam, line up your two pieces. Done this a bit crudely, but hopefully it gives you the idea, and then just press them into shape. And when you get the glue splurging out, just wipe it off. And that dries in literally a few minutes, but it's quite a good way for holding delicate leather shapes if you want to keep them aligned nicely. Tip number 6 is about getting a nice accurate stitch line right up to your edge, and the best way to do this is by one of these adjustable edge guides. You can adjust them both up and down. They have a little roller wheel, and they just make sure that your stitches line up nicely against your edge. So I'll just show you the sort of thing I mean. So if you're going around a curve, for example, you get a nice alignment. I'm sorry if on camera this machine squeaks. It doesn't squeak as much in real life, but the audio sometimes picks it up. That's the sort of thing I mean. You get a lovely accurate stitch line around the curve. Hopefully that's just about showing up. Well, number 7 is actually adjusting your stitch size. If you think about it, if I was doing this corner with large stitches, it would actually be quite difficult to control the machine as you're going around the corner, because with large stitches your machine is running faster. So you've got less time to control that curvature. If you take the stitch size down so they're quite small stitches, it's like walking around. It's far slower. It's not like running around, and it's far easier to control your machine. Now I know that is really obvious, but I have to say people don't think about it. I didn't think about it until I'd sewn quite a lot, and it does make a huge difference. It may just come intuitively to you, but it's worth bearing that in mind. Take the stitch size down, it gets a lot easier to control it. Number 8's really all about practice. And the more you try sewing something, practice on scrap, the better you'll get. And you'll get better quite quickly, it's surprising. One of the things I find, again, if you're doing shapes and curves, which one has to do quite a lot in leather work, it's worth keeping a certain speed and rhythm going. I find if I go too slowly on doing a curve, it can start to look a bit stilted. Whereas if you move fairly smoothly and quickly, the answer is being smooth the whole time. If you're fairly smooth with your machine, you'll get a nice good quality stitching. And number 9 is very similar to if you're hand sewing. It really does pay to hammer your stitches down. They'll look so much neater. So you just have a plastic hammer, nylon hammer, an anvil, and just go along. And what you're doing is you're bedding those stitches down into the leather. And do it both sides, particularly on the reverse side it's worth doing. And it just sinks the stitches right down and makes it neater. It also will probably make them last longer because they get a bit more buried into the leather. But it's really worth doing that. You'll be amazed at the difference. And then finally, number 10 is if you've got loose ends, you can obviously trim them. I use the little snips for this. But what is also quite a good idea, if you've got a tiny little end, like a 2 or 3 millimeter end, you can just burn it off. And it puts a little ball on the end and stops it getting dragged through. Obviously, when you're stitching a seam, you go back on your stitches 4 or 5 stitches to lock them in. But in addition to that, if you just burn off the ends with a lighter, if it's bonded nylon, you can do it and it looks very neat, and it gets rid of the loose end, puts a little ball on which can't really be seen, and locks that stitch even more so. So another little tip worth bearing in mind. I'm sure if I applied my mind I could probably think of a few more tips, and I'm sure you can think of a few more tips, but I thought I'd put down 10 as starters just to help anyone who's perhaps having a go at some machining for the first time. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that one. Bye bye.